I'm going to talk about weed control, mostly from an organic perspective. So I'm the horticulture extension agent for K-State Research and Extension in Douglas County. So the Lawrence metro area is where I serve. And in addition to that, for the past 15 years, I have been growing vegetables and some fruits organically in Kansas. For whatever reason, a number of years ago, there was a art professor at the University of Kansas who was doing an art show on new farmers, is what it was called. So he came out to my farm and took a number of decorative art shots of me, mostly holding weeds. As an organic farmer, I spend a lot of my time thinking about weeds. I really have a lot of respect for weeds, and the weed I'm holding there, Johnson grass, is probably my #1 challenge on my own farm. So everything I'm going to talk about today is informed by that experience. And I do really think about weeds a lot, enjoy thinking about them. So, you know, if you have questions, I feel like my talk, I'm trying to keep it more of a conceptual overview at the beginning. I'll talk about a hands-on experiment I performed with a number of, or a trial I performed with a number of Douglas County growers, the second part, but I'm happy to dive down more into hands-on questions, which people almost always seem to have about weeds. Also, one more thing to mention, 15 years ago when I was getting started, I was a growing grower's apprentice, and I actually very vividly remember this workshop and some of the things I learned there, which I will reference in this talk a little bit later. So with that, I will jump into it. Just like to mention in all of my presentations, you know, that K-State is an affirmative action, equal opportunity employer, and we provide services to all of Kansas residents. Just like to acknowledge that and make sure everyone feels aware of that as we get started. So here's the big question. What is a weed? And I get, you know, as an extension agent, people call me up and ask, you know, I've got this plant, is that a weed or is it not a weed? And that's a question I can't really answer, because a weed is really something growing somewhere we don't want it. So had tomatoes in my hoop house last year. Some of them fell and went to seed. So this spring I had a huge crop of volunteer tomato seedlings. They were very definitely a weed in my hoop house. Now, if you ask most people, is a tomato a weed? The answer would be no. But really the thing that it comes down to is that where you want that plant. And I have this picture here because this is something that in my mind is a fun one to think about. So this is a decorative amaranth. People are growing that for fun. It's a very close cousin of pigweed, which is one of my nemesis. I don't know what the correct plural of that is. But thinking about people growing this for fun, you know, really, that's the question. Is this a weed? Is it not a weed? And if you're trying to grow it, it's not a weed. If you aren't trying to grow it, it definitely is a weed. So with that as background, you know, there isn't necessarily a list of things that are weeds, things that aren't, but plants in places you don't want them are probably weeds. And why is this a problem? So these plants, if they're where you don't want them, can compete with the plants you do want in that location for light, nutrients, and water. Some of them provide an alternate host for pests and diseases. I have tried over the years to grow rhubarb. I'm kind of getting out of that production practice. But dock, which is generally, I would say, a relatively innocuous weed for a vegetable grower, can be a problem because it's an alternate host for the rhubarb cucurleo, which is a pest on rhubarb. So that weed wouldn't bother me at all, except that I grow rhubarb. So weeds can be a problem in that regard. Weeds can make work less fun on the farm. Even if you have a plant that's strongly competing against the weeds, if you have a real weedy row, going out there and working in that row really isn't fun. And to me, that seems like less of a big deal to me as a person, because I'm willing to, I guess, not have fun on the farm sometimes. But when you have workers, what I've noticed is they work less hard if they're not having that much fun. So you know, keeping things well weeded in addition to helping your plants can also help you feel better about being on the farm. And then the last one, you know, weeds, if you let them get away from you can definitely make your neighbors hate you. So, you know, this can be a problem. I am going to talk in a minute here about noxious weeds, which can be a big problem if you're trying to grow organically and your neighbors start disliking you and you have noxious weeds. But I'll explain that in a second. So with that kind of background about weeds, okay, we'll go through some critical concepts. These are things that I'm going to talk about during the presentation, but I just was thinking about what are the key takeaways that I hope people pick up throughout my presentation. If you get to the end and some of these are still question marks in your mind, feel free to ask about them. So weed seed bank, this is a really key term. I'll explain in a minute. Noxious weeds, I'll talk about that a lot. I get a lot of questions about noxious weeds as an extension agent, and I very clearly understand a lot of people don't understand that term. Integrated weed management. So Carrie did a great job setting up this presentation, the series of presentations using the IPM or integrated pest management framework in your head. And so I'm going to talk about the weed portion of that, which we call integrated weed management. I'm not going to put up the exact same slide he did, but I am going to try and work through the sort of similar concepts as that triangle in terms of how do we build a system to manage weeds. I'll talk about this, this concept, weed the soil, not the crop. I really have enjoyed that. I feel like as an organic grower, that's a framework that was put forward by some Pennsylvania growers, I believe the Nordells, but it's really applicable for how to manage weeds, especially in this integrated weed management framework, and as organic farmers when we can't really retreat to chemicals quite as easily as some other people. I'll talk about smother crops. Dr. Rivard talked a little bit about using cover crops to break up weed cycles, and smother crops can be maybe the go-to on that. And I'll talk about stale seed bedding. I will talk about other weed control techniques. So this is just one technique, but I do feel like it's one that's really powerful, one that I haven't experimented with as much as I should. I came to it relatively late, I think, but I think it's a super valuable concept. So that's why it's emphasized here over something like cultivation. All right. So moving along. So if you had that decorative amaranth, it can produce a lot of seeds. So this is its cousin. You see a picture of that in the foreground here. So this is red-rooted pigweed. And there's a space between a couple of rows of plastic mulch where red-rooted pigweed had been allowed to go to seed in the past. And you see what happens. So this is not, you know, baby cut lettuce. Every one of those little red seedlings is a red-rooted pigweed. And what I remember from my first class on weed management, which was that Growing Growers class 15 years ago, was that a red-rooted pigweed, if you let it go to seed, will produce over 900,000 seeds. And those seeds will stay viable in your soil for somewhere between 15 and 20 years. So if you let one plant fully mature, go to seed, you're looking at a problem like the one that's in front of you here. So that's a lot of weeds to kill, and it can be a big problem. So thinking about that, that's kind of a tie-in to that first concept, the weed seed bank. So that's what happens when you let weeds go to seed. They deposit those seeds into the soil. Those seeds sit in the soil till the conditions are right, and then they will germinate. And as Dr. Rivard said, you know, they're opportunists. So red-rooted pigweed really likes disturbance. So freshly tilled soil, if you have a lot of those seeds, you're going to get something that looks like this, which if you get to it at this stage isn't terribly hard to deal with. We'll talk a little bit about how to deal with things like that. But if you let any of these or any small percentage of these escape, you can be having, you know, 10 times as many seeds next year. So weed management is really critical, and staying on top of it is super critical, especially in organic farming, just because the options we have as organic growers are significantly more limited, although the options for conventional vegetable growers are much limited comparison to row crops. But so we're going to talk about, you know, what to do with a situation like that. I'm going to talk about this slide briefly just to give you kind of a key word for the glossary, and that is noxious weeds. So I like to think of there are different kinds of weeds, noxious weeds and obnoxious weeds. So often when people ask me about a weed, it's one that is particularly obnoxious, like red-rooted pigweed. And they use the term, just because it's out there, noxious weeds, to talk about that. And that isn't really correct, because what a noxious weed is actually a legally defined category that until very recently was defined by the Kansas state legislature with some county options. And they've changed that law a little bit. So now there's a panel that will designate obnoxious weeds. But so in Kansas, we have 12 designated noxious weeds with 2 county options, which means your county can decide if those 2 weeds, bull thistle and multiflora rose, are on the noxious weed list. And once something is on the noxious weed list, what that means is if it gets reported to the county weed control department, they actually have legal recourse to come onto your property and control it if you don't control it yourself. So there's a path that this goes through. They'll send you a warning. They'll follow up usually before they would just come on and control it. But basically these weeds are problem weeds, but they're not the sole problem weeds in the state of Kansas. But if you don't control these problem weeds on your property, you can get into some legal issues. So they can come on and what the county noxious weed department would do would be to spray these weeds, which if you're certified organic is going to void your certification on that piece of land for 3 years after that event. And then they're going to send you a bill for that. So while we want to really control all weeds, these weeds are especially ones we want to keep under control. And like when I made the comment earlier about your neighbors, if your neighbors aren't real happy with your organic farming practices, then you have a lot of Johnson grass, they can report you to the county and you can have additional problems. Now, this doesn't happen a whole lot. I haven't ever run into an organic grower reaching out to me to say that they've been reported for that, but it's certainly something to keep in mind. I know people go to extra lengths to really try and control these weeds so that they don't run into problems, which I think is the purpose of the law. And I did mention that law has changed recently, so there is a board that provides advice as to what goes onto this list and what comes off of this list, because a couple of these, I think maybe pig nut is a problem in one county out in western Kansas, and the rest of the state, it's pretty much not an issue. So that one, I believe, maybe is going to come off. There was another one they had talked about. But just so you know, that board does have representation. There's a member of the Kansas Specialty Crop Growers Association that gets to be on that board to provide input as to what are weeds that maybe are problems that should be controlled. And so that's what a noxious weed is. Now, most of the rest of the weeds, they're just obnoxious weeds. They create problems for us. The ones that create big problems, you know, they're tough to deal with, but people often use that term incorrectly. So I just wanted to clear that up. And so moving on. So we'll talk about this idea of integrated weed management. You know, so weeds are one of the many pests we deal with. And so thinking about this framework, it's going to be more or less the same framework that you'll go through for any of the other pests, through insects, for plant diseases, but the tools you use at each step are a little bit differently. So for integrated pest management, the important thing to think about, and with weed management, the goal is to manage these, not to necessarily eliminate those. Now, for certain weeds, it might be pretty close to eliminating them, because when I talk about a single red-rooted pigweed can produce 900,000 seeds, if you let that go to seed, you've got a really big problem. So the goal maybe is to eliminate all of those, but something else like henbit, which is a winter annual that's mostly done by the time you're planting tomatoes, you might just want to manage that or not even spend any effort trying to control that weed if it's not a problem for you. So our goal isn't to get rid of weeds entirely. Our goal is to manage them in a way that allows us to grow the crops we want to grow. And so the first step in this, I'll call it scouting, but this kind of ties up that bottom of that triangle where knowledge is really important. So you need to figure out what's going on before it's an emergency. So you need to be out in your field, looking at what little things are germinating, because like I've said, you know, the difference between a red-rooted pigweed and a henbit is one of those is a huge problem, the other one not so much. If you can't tell the difference between those, it falls seedling time. Um, you know, you might spend a lot of effort trying to control something that isn't a problem, or you might spend not enough effort at controlling something that's a huge problem. So this is really the challenging part about this integrated management. It's really, you have to build up your knowledge to do it in the best possible way. And then the next thing is I like to think of as just kind of building up these multiple layers of defense. So the first layer is preventative cultural practices. So making sure you're growing things well, using these preventative cultural practices. This helps keep those problems from spiraling out of control. Then there are some mechanical controls we can use, and we'll talk about those. Cultivation is probably the key weed control tool for organic farmers. So mechanical controls are huge for us. Biological treatments, this will be more relevant probably for insect pests. There aren't too many for weeds. There are a few actually. Some of those noxious weeds have biological controls. There's actually a mite they use out in Colorado to control bindweed. And when I found out about that, I was super excited. And I was trying to figure out how can I get this mite to control bindweed. Well, apparently it doesn't work too well in Kansas. The Kansas Department of Agriculture has done some trials on it. So unfortunately, there's no like biological way to control bindweed short of killing it. So we're really back in those sort of mechanical controls. Chemical controls, for organic growers, there are some organic herbicides which will kill weeds. But the challenge is, and I'm not going to talk a lot about them just because they're not terribly effective. So they are a contact herbicide and they'll really kill what they contact. But for perennials, they don't do a good job killing those, and they tend to be really, really expensive to use on larger scale applications. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about organic chemical controls. They do exist. I don't know anyone that uses them at any scale just because of the cost and sort of lack of efficacy of them. So scouting and assessing, preventing, controlling, and dealing with the weeds. So this is the steps I kind of think of when we're going through. So this is not exactly lining up with those IPM things, but when you're scouting and assessing, you're figuring out what the problems are. Preventing is you're taking steps to prevent those problems from happening, you know, keep them from getting out of control. If they start blooming, if the weeds start germinating, that's when we're in this stage that I call control. So you have a weed problem on your farm. What do you do to control that? And then dealing, this is kind of the last ditch efforts I'll talk about. I've done all of the things that we call, that I put down in that area, but they're not something that I think a lot of extension agents generally talk about. They're the kinds of things you're not supposed to have to do on your farm. But so the critical thing, the first step, like I said with scouting, is assessing your issues. So every farm has different weed populations, and those are influenced by the history of what's gone there, what amendments you've brought in. For instance, on my own farm, I do have a couple of places where I have problems with bindweed, and I never had those problems until I bought some straw from one certain supplier. So I brought in those straw bales as mulch, which is a great practice for your garden, but they had some bindweed seeds in them. So now I have bindweed problems in those two areas. So you know, that's something that wasn't here when I bought the property, but now it's a perennial problem I have to deal with. So some weeds are annuals, and really, you know, you have to figure out how to kill those every year. But if you control those for a number of years, you can deplete that weed seed bank. So those weeds are putting seeds into the soil. Those seeds are germinating. and then if you kill that next year's batch, you've taken down the population of viable seeds in that soil. If you keep doing that over time, those weeds will become less of a problem. So that's where that weed seed bank is really important. So you've got to be lowering the number of viable seeds in there. That will help you control those annuals. Now, perennials are kind of that same battle because they will set seeds, but you're also dealing with something else. So it might not be a way to just knock those out one time. You have to repeatedly deal with them. So something like the Johnson grass that I was holding up on that first slide, it will set seeds. And you can prevent it from doing that. So you could mow the Johnson grass every time it keeps getting big enough that it's going to set seeds, and you will prevent it from spreading by seeds. But that Johnson grass is also spreading underground with rhizomes. So even if you mow it, as long as it's adding energy into those rhizomes, they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So even though you might be depleting the weed seed bank, you're not solving the problem of that perennial weed. So annual and perennial weeds, different problems. They need to be addressed a little bit differently. What crops you're growing. So like I said, you know, henbit isn't a big problem, or maybe not a problem at all if you're just growing tomatoes. If you're trying to grow spinach, it can be a bit of a problem because it will be germinating at the same time as fall planted spinach. And so if that spinach is popping, you get henbit in it, it makes harvest a little bit more complicated. So what your weed issues are depends on the crop you're growing. So likewise, if you would only happen to grow something in the spring and the fall, and you could manage to mow the rest of your property or keep it clean cultivated the rest of the year, things like Johnson grass maybe wouldn't be a huge deal for you because you're not farming somewhere during its sort of active growing cycle. So the crops you're growing really change what weeds are a problem and how they're a problem. And like I mentioned earlier with the bindweed, the weed populations on your farms change over season and over years. So as you deplete the weed seed bank for some of those annuals, they become less of a problem. If you shift from a system that's very tillage dependent, where you're turning a lot of ground every year, to one where you're going to no-till, so if you move to no-till vegetable production, that pigweed becomes way less of a problem. So that's a transition I've been working on over the past few years. And pigweed really isn't that big of a deal because it likes that freshly disturbed soil. So as soon as you run through and till that, all those pigweed seeds are going to go to town. If you're not tilling that, pigweed becomes much less of a problem, but some of those perennials, the bindweeds, the Johnson grasses, they become more of a problem. You know, and like I said with the henbit, some weeds aren't too bad. So this is knowing what's creating problems for your system and controlling those and not spending that energy on the things that aren't a problem for your system. So preventing this is really our first layer of defense here. And this is the idea of, you know, keeping the weeds from getting out of control, sometimes even keeping them from germinating. So this whole idea of weed the soil, not the crop, that the Nordells put forward. I know Gardens of Egan, which is a big organic farm up in Minnesota, relied heavily on this. They've got good documentation on this, but this is basically the idea of depleting that weed seed bank year after year after year, not letting anything go to seed, and just trying to make sure you get some seeds that germinate and then you kill them. So like that picture I had of the thousands of pigweed seedlings, if you had run through there with a cultivator right after those seedlings were there, you know, you could have killed thousands of seeds in one go. If you let those get bigger, you've got problems. But the whole idea of the weed the soil, not the crop, is you are trying to deplete that seed bank over time, so you are making weeds less of a problem on your farm over time. Cover crops can be a tool for this. So these are, you know, some cover crops are well suited to this. Cover crops have a variety of different uses, but some of them compete very nicely with weeds. And so using cover crops to fill those those voids, you know, because weeds are striving to fill that void that you've created in nature, where there is soil that doesn't have something growing. If you grow cover crops there, you can prevent some of those weeds from germinating, or you can outcompete them so that they don't complete their life cycle and go to seed. Stale seed bedding is another technique I really like. So this is just preparing your bed for planting and then letting the weeds germinate that are going to germinate there, and then killing them before you plant. So weeds germinate in a very thin layer, the germination zone of the soil. So depending on the size of the seed, that will be deeper or shallower. But in general, if you are forming your beds that you're going to plant in, letting the seeds that germinate in that area germinate, and then killing them without changing the soil that's in that area. So if you're not bringing new soil into that germination zone, you're depleting the seed bank in that germination zone. And that's what we call stale seed bedding. So sometimes that works really naturally if you just let the bed sit for a couple of weeks before you're ready to plant. If we get rainfall, that works great. In Kansas, sometimes that means irrigating a seed bed that you haven't planted yet, just to get all those weeds that are in there to pop, and then killing them and then planting. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the trial I worked with some Douglas County farmers on, because it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the basic theory of stale seed bedding. There's a couple of things that can relate to that I've liked experimenting with lately: occultation and solarization. So occultation is basically depriving the seeds of light. So if you get weed seeds that germinate, but then they don't get any light, they will die. So this is putting dark tarps essentially over garden beds. Solarization is kind of the reverse of that. You're putting transparent tarps over space or transparent plastic. You're allowing the sun to heat that up, and you're creating the greenhouse effect in that germination zone. And either the weeds will germinate and it will get too hot in there and they will die, or the soil will heat up in that germination zone and you will actually sterilize the seeds because they'll get too hot. Also, preventing weeds around your plants. Mulch is a great tool for that. Either plastic or a biological mulch. This does kind of the same thing as occultation. It prevents that soil surface from getting enough light for some of those weeds to germinate. And if they germinate, you know, if they're not strong enough to grow through that mulch, if you have plastic, you know, they probably won't grow through it. But if you have a straw mulch or a hay mulch or something, if those weeds aren't strong enough to go through it, they'll die before they get the sunlight, and you will have prevented those weeds from becoming a problem. So those are all kinds of ways to manage weeds, preventing them. So don't even let them get established. So cover crops I talked about really briefly. I love cover crops because they do a good job of managing weeds if you plant the right crops at the right time. But the other thing is you can get all sorts of other growth, other benefits for your system from cover crops. So, you know, cover crops can suppress weeds. Some of them are really great at it, like buckwheat is good for weed suppression. Sorghum Sudan grass is great for weed suppression. Sun hemp are great for weed suppression, but those cover crops all have other benefits. So buckwheat is really quick growing. It adds a little bit of organic matter, but it's great for pollinators. It produces so much nectar. You really can feed a lot of pollinators with buckwheat. Sorghum Sudan grass, it's a close cousin of Johnson grass, so it's one of the few cover crops that really, as a mid-season cover, I think effectively competes if you have a fast-growing weed like Johnson grass. But it adds a ton of organic matter to your system. So as an organic grower, building soil health is always critical. So using cover crops where you can get this benefit of weed suppression and adding organic matter is really great. And then I mentioned sun hemp too. So that is a fast growing summer cover also, which can compete with Johnson grass in my experience, but it fixes a lot of nitrogen. So, you know, the nice thing about cover crops as a weed management tool, you can manage weeds while building some other facets of your farming system. So here's actually a mix of sun hemp and sorghum Sudan grass I grew a few years ago. Just really great. It puts on a ton of organic matter, fixes a little bit of nitrogen, and can outcompete almost any summer weed. So if we've, you know, moved past prevention stage. I like to think of the next step as kind of controlling. So you have some weeds, there are weeds out there in the world. How do you control them? As an organic grower, a lot of our control options, like I mentioned before, are mechanical control, and that depends on all sorts of different scales. But for any of these mechanical controls, timing is very critical. So it's really easy to kill weeds when they're little. It gets harder to kill them as they get bigger. So you need to get out there as quickly as you can and kill those weeds when they germinate. Now, when we're receiving regular rainfall, a new crop of weeds will germinate every 7 to 10 days. So this does mean getting through your fields repeatedly over the course of a growing season, at least until the crop you're growing will kind of close canopy, shade out some of that soil, and prevent the weeds from competing and getting going. So, you know, in this mechanical control, that can be everything from pushing a wheel hoe, using a hand hoe, all the way to a cultivating tractor. So that's an old Farmall Cub there that has an offset engine that's designed specifically for cultivating. So you could look straight down at the rows you're cultivating. The other tractor implement there is a spring tine harrow. Those are a really fun tool, but they're the most unnerving thing I've ever used. So basically it's solid rows of spring tines that cover every inch of the ground. So it's doing what we call blind cultivation. And those are set up to the point that they won't kill established plants, but they will kill anything that's not established yet. So you set out your transplants, you wait a week for them to root, and then you run that over it, and it hits every plant behind the tractor. And your goal is to basically damage the weeds more than you're damaging your crops. If you time it perfectly, it's a great tool. If you don't, the weeds are already too big and they just blow by it. But that is why timing is really critical. So weeds are really easy to control when they're small. Likewise, when you're hoeing, there's all kinds of different hoes you can use, stirrup hoes, you know, sort of thin collinear hoes. They're really designed for slicing through the ground and disturbing the ground when those weeds are tiny. If you get one of those old, you know, big giant headed chopping hoes, those are designed to kill the bigger weeds, but it's so much more effort to weed a 100-foot row if you have to go and chop out 6-inch tall weeds. Versus if you're just killing things that are what we call the thread stage. Their roots just a tiny little thread, and if you cut that off, they will die pretty instantly. So like that row of pigweed I showed earlier, if you'd gotten through there right at that stage, they're just a little bit bigger than thread stage, and they would have died very quickly. If you let those get a foot taller than they were, pigweeds are just terrible to kill once they get any size. Like you can pull them out of the ground, lay them down, and if you get any moisture within the next like 2 days, they're going to reroot and start growing up sideways. But if you kill them when they're little, they die pretty easy. Then here's the last phase that I feel like people don't talk about enough. But as an organic farmer, you're going to get to these where the weeds get away from you. So this is kind of like, how do you cope with those weeds? So hand weeding can be an option if you have a very valuable crop. You can get in there and hand weed. And I know people that have done that for a lot of things. It's super frustrating. So you do probably want to kind of gauge the value of your crop versus the value of your labor. It takes a long time to get through there. And by hand weeding, I mean pulling by hand, not just chopping with a hoe. Hand harvest. So here you see a picture of me harvesting some spinach in a row that is totally overgrown with henbit, which I mentioned earlier. So the spinach is, you know, the bigger green leaves. So to harvest the spinach, instead of grabbing whole bunches and chopping and just moving effortlessly down the row, I am picking individual leaves so I don't get a bucket full of henbit. It's possible. It was, you know, economically viable at the time I was doing this, but it is a way, you know, you have to kind of make that calculation when you get to that point where you've sort of lost the battle against the weeds, and so now you're trying to win the war, I guess. Abandoning your crop, you know, this is something that you might have to do, and you have to make that decision at a certain point. If you have a bunch of weeds that are about to go to seed and you have a crop that's not quite ready, you might just till it under. You know, like I said, those weed seeds have a viability of, you know, maybe up to 20 years, you might need to weigh that balance. Like, you're going to take a loss on that crop this year, but you're saving yourself 20 years of headaches going forward if you don't let those weeds go to seed. And that's kind of the last point here. They actually, the weed ecologists, they call the term seed rain. So once the weeds are going to seed and all those seeds are falling down, they call it rain because they fall down like that. And that's really your goal, is you have to prevent those seeds from coming out, from creating bigger problems for yourself in the future. So that's, when you get to this point, it's really kind of a balancing act. Like, you know, can I harvest this crop before the weed seeds become viable? Or can I, you know, if there's not 1,000 pig weeds, can I go break them off and allow some sort of hand harvest? So this is kind of the last resort in weed control. So with that kind of framework, I'd like to just talk a little bit about what that means. We talked about integrated pest management, and that's not a single strategy, that's a system. So how do you put this knowledge together and build a system? Well, you have to realize what I've said there. There's multiple ways to manage your weeds. And for any given weed, there's a number of different ways to control it. For any set of problems, there's a number of different ways to control it. So you have to choose the system that works best for you. And so you have to choose something that works for your farm and for your weeds. So like I said, you know, if you have a lot of problems on your farm with perennial weeds, like Johnson grass or bindweed, mulching maybe isn't the right answer, because a lot of those will just blow through mulch, unless you use plastic mulch. But if you're using a biological mulch, that might not be the right answer. You might have to go to clean cultivation. Likewise, if you don't have a big tractor, you're going to have a harder time doing something like the spring harrow, although they've made sort of smaller hand-sized ones recently. So maybe that's less true than it used to be, but you have to build a system that works for you. And you need to have some flexibility, because, you know, every year is going to be different. The timing of the rainfall changes a lot what weeds germinate when. Usually this time of year, we kind of have a dry spell and weeds stop germinating for a little bit. But so far around here, we've been getting regular moisture through July, and the weeds are still coming. So you have to be flexible and ready to work with whatever the year throws at you. As an example, this is actually from a presentation about the University of Kentucky student farm. So this is their sort of system of integrated weed management. So they have all of these different pieces that they use in different years in different places. So they use allelopathic cover crops. So I didn't talk about allelopathy, but those are chemicals that are exuded by a crop that actually inhibit the germination of other seeds. So sorghum sudan grass does this a little bit. Ryegrass will do this a little bit as it breaks down. So if you chop up some rye, it will exude chemicals that make it hard for weed seeds to germinate for a couple of weeks. So they use those allelopathic cover crops in their system. They use mulches, both living and dead mulches. They use subsurface drip irrigation. So if they're not watering the surface area of their whole field, you know, the weeds aren't going to germinate in the row middles. They'll just germinate right above that drip irrigation where they're getting water. They use stale seed bedding, so letting the weeds germinate, killing them prior to planting. They also do very restricted fertilizer placement. If you're broadcasting fertilizer across your field, you're not only fertilizing your crops, you're fertilizing the weeds. So if you just do that in banding where your plant roots are going to be, you won't be fertilizing the weeds as much. Timely and effective between row cultivation. Like I said, with that cultivation thing, timing is everything. So if you have to get through that field, you need to prioritize that, because if you wait a week, those weeds will probably be too big and you might need a different system. You might have to go to hand weeding. And using effective in-row cultivation. So not just doing something, but making sure that what they're doing is actually killing the weeds. And so for you, like thinking through that, those are all the steps they built out. When you're building an integrated system on your farm, you have to weigh these trade-offs. So if you do, in any given year, if you mulch a bed, it makes cultivation extremely difficult. So you have to decide, if I have problems with perennial weeds in that bed, maybe I should not mulch it, because all of that debris gets in the way of being able to use a cultivator. If you're going to mulch it, you need to make sure you do it good enough. If you're using a biological mulch, make sure you put enough on there that you're going to suppress those weeds, because otherwise you've made a system where it's hard to cultivate and the mulch isn't effective. So you've really limited your weeding options to maybe hand pulling. Some things like mulch can also provide a pest habitat. So if you're growing a crop that's susceptible to, pests that would overwinter in mulch, you might want to think about that when you're building out your system. The flip side of that is, if you move away from mulches, clean cultivation, running cultivators or hose or anything through your field, that disturbs soil microbes and it decreases your soil health. So like on my farm, I've tried to move away as much as I can from clean cultivation, just because I have a really light sandy soil and I have a hard time keeping organic matter. So I'm trying to kill or I'm trying to suppress weeds through mulch to build that organic matter rather than killing them by repeated cultivation. So just as an example of maybe how some farmers play around with stuff, I'll talk about a SARE research grant I did where I worked with 3 farms in the Douglas County area. So this is Mellow Fields, Red Tractor Farm, and Moon on the Meadow. We did a trial in 2018 and 2019 of a few different stale seedbed methods. So the specific problem we were looking at here was for fall direct seeded crops. So things like spinach, beets, and carrots that they're planting direct seeding into the soil in the fall. That's a big problem because pigweed especially likes the nice fine seed beds you would prepare for those crops. And all of those crops germinate and start growing much more slowly than pigweed. Now in the spring, pigweed is less of a problem in those crops because it only likes to germinate in warm soils. So it's not a huge problem in spring planted spinach because the spinach is up and growing before the pigweed, the soil's warm enough for it to germinate. But in the fall, the soil's already warm and you're planting these things and the pigweed just outcompetes. So those 3 farms all mentioned having that problem in 2017. So we tried to figure out what could we do to solve that problem. And especially this is a problem in crops with high planting density. So in-row weeding is really challenging on something like carrots. So our objective was to figure out what we could do with minimal tillage to help these farms manage pigweed and analyze the amount of labor time necessary. So we trialed a variety of stale seed bedding options. We tried occultation, flame weeding, and also a Powerharrow. And then we tried something else that was a little bit different, the paper pot transplanter, using this just in the theory that if we planted those crops at a larger size, the pigweed wouldn't be able to outcompete them. So they'd already be germinated. You wouldn't be waiting for them to germinate while the pigweed's already growing. So occultation is just putting dark tarps over the soil surface to allow the weeds to germinate but not get light so that those seeds then die. Flame weeding, I'm not sure if I can play this, but here's a video of a little, the pyro weeder just cooking some weeds. So this is a way to, you let those little weeds germinate, you run the flame weeder over the top of them. You can see a little flame on the ground. The goal isn't to actually ignite the weeds, but the heat of that ruptures their cell walls and the weeds will die. Oh, and here's the Powerharrow, which is just kind of like a rototiller, except instead of turning this way, it turns this way. So that Powerharrow will kill those small weeds, but it doesn't bring new weed seeds up to that surface layer. So it's just mixing the soil horizontally, not vertically. So we tried all of those, and we also tried the paper pot transplanter, which just allows you to transplant relatively easily at higher densities than maybe by hand would allow you, as a way to compete with weeds. So here's an example on farm 1 in our first year. You can see this is actually spinach, is the taller grassy looking leaves in there, and then all the rest of that stuff is henbit. And here's the unfortunate result of our trial, is the one there with all those little henbits is the Powerharrow, the flame weeding, and then actually our control was the best. So we did this again the second year, and the results weren't quite that stark. Yeah, so here's a picture of that from a distance. But basically, between all of those methods, there wasn't really a significant difference in the amount of time necessary to manage the weeds. Yeah, so there's a closer look a little bit later. So the spinach is a little bit bigger, and you can see those henbit, the little purplish leaves. Here's another farm that just did occultation. So the occultation decreased the weed pressure, they told me, from previous years, but obviously, you know, based on this picture, it did not control the weed pressure. Like, they still had a ton of weeds out there, unmanageable amount of weeds. Yeah, so there are carrots in there. Here's farm 3, which it's a little hard to see because these rows are mixed here, but you can kind of look in this background here is this sort of grassy debris in the rows, and you can see how there's more in the other. So that grassy debris was actually foxtail that germinated and then was frost killed. So where there's less debris, there were fewer weeds prior to frost. And so this is the control on the left there, you see has kind of the most debris. The Powerharrow has significantly less debris, and occultation has probably about the same as the Powerharrow. So our observations here were that a single method didn't effectively control the weeds, but they did do a little bit of unscripted trying where they would do something like occultation and then use the Powerharrow after that. And combining those methods did really kind of control the weeds. Unfortunately, that slide I took from the University of Kentucky student organic farm, I saw that presentation after we had built this trial, and what they found is that when you're doing stale seed bedding like we're trying here, really the most effective method is you need 3 passes. So you need to let the weeds germinate 3 times, kill them, let them germinate, you know, let them germinate once, kill them, let them germinate again, kill them, let them germinate a 3rd time and kill them. I think the first time they noted it's like you have, you know, maybe like 60% weed control, but if you have a bed that's 40% weeds, that's still an unacceptably high amount of weeds. So all of our trials we were doing here was kind of single control, and that just didn't work. So if you're going to do stale seed bedding, you've got to do multiple passes to really be effective. And I think at like the 3rd pass, they were at like 95% control. And then the 4th pass, they were maybe at like 96. So it kind of diminishes after that. But so if you're going to do stale seed bedding, really having them ready like 6 weeks before you plant, let the weeds germinate for 2 weeks, kill them, let the next batch germinate, kill them, and then plant is kind of the secret. And the paper pot transplanter was nice because it did have some gains that extended beyond weed control. So they were allowed to get some earliness in production. And the 2 farms that experimented with that both use the paper pot transplanter a lot to this day, in part because it helps with the weed control, but also just they realize the value of that technology for their production systems beyond just weed control. But it did help with weeds in that you just get bigger plants to compete against the weeds. So there's a picture of occultation. And this is one of those things, if you are trying to incorporate something new like this into your system, as an example of some things we learned. So you buy these silage tarps, they have a white side and a black side. If you put the black side up in the summer, it raises the heat, and for some weed seeds, that can just kind of knock them into dormancy rather than killing them. So then when you pull that off, they'll all just germinate. So that kind of creates that delayed germination versus termination, whereas early in the season, that warming will help them germinate faster and then they'll die. And also the occultation, the challenge our farmers had was when they put this down and it gets rained on, if they have nice friable soil, that will compact the soil. So they actually really liked it when they were using the occultation, if they would follow it up with a power harrow to just kind of fluff the soil up again, because they would get some compaction with the weight of the water on there. And timing is challenging, just like with the stale seed bedding. You start having to think, 6-8 weeks out prior to planting, when do I want to plant this there? Now I need to get the tarp out there. So both of those techniques have some challenges, but nothing insurmountable. So with that, I just want to mention a couple of resources here. SARE.org has a lot of good resources on weed control. So they have a book, Steel in the Field. You can get the digital copy for free. eExtension.org has some good things. There's a thing on YouTube called eOrganic, and they have a series called Weed 'em and Reap that has a lot of good videos on organic weed control. So those are some other resources you can reach out to. With that, if you have questions, I'm happy to take them now, or if you don't want to ask them now, you can send me an email or call my office. And with that, I will stop my share and open it up to any questions.